"Sign here," Ethan Whitmore said, and slid the divorce papers across the table so hard they knocked her coffee cup to the floor. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. He looked at his watch. If that man's arrogance just made your blood boil, you are not alone. Welcome, and please subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. She left the marriage with nothing. One phone call brought him to his knees. The papers landed crooked on the mahogany table, half of them sliding off the edge onto the carpet of the 42nd floor conference room at Whitmore & Associates. Madeline Carter did not pick them up. She sat very still in the leather chair across from her husband of 19 years and watched him check his Rolex like she was an inconvenience between meetings. The attorney beside Ethan, a sharp-jawed man named Gerald Foss, who Madeline had met at dinner parties no fewer than a dozen times, cleared his throat and began speaking in the careful, practiced tone of a man paid to make terrible things sound reasonable. "Mrs. Whitmore, the terms are straightforward. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to offer you a clean settlement in exchange for your full cooperation and your signature today." Madeline looked at the man. "What does the settlement include?" Gerald opened a leather folder. "The marital home will transfer entirely to Mr. Whitmore, as it was purchased under his corporate holding entity prior to the marriage. The investment accounts similarly are held in the name of Whitmore Capital and are therefore not subject to division under the terms of your prenuptial agreement." Madeline's voice was quiet. "I never signed a prenuptial agreement." The room went still. Ethan turned his head toward her for the first time since she'd walked through the door. His expression was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was patient. The patience of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the other person to understand it. "You did sign one, Madeline, 8 months before the wedding. Don't you remember? We had dinner at Le Bernardin afterward. You had the halibut." She stared at him. "I have never seen a prenuptial agreement with your name on it." "Your signature is on page 9, Gerald said, and slid a document toward her, along with the initials of 2 witnesses and a notary seal dated April 14th, 19 years ago. Madeline looked at the page. The signature looked like hers. The handwriting curved the same way. But she knew with the same certainty that she knew her own name that she had never sat down and signed that document. She had never been handed it. She had never been told it existed. She looked up at Ethan. He was already looking out the window. "You forged it," she said. "I would be very careful about making accusations in a room full of legal witnesses," Gerald said mildly. "I would be very careful," Ethan said, still looking at the skyline, "about burning what goodwill I have left to offer you." He turned then, and his voice dropped to something low and flat. "I'm giving you $32,000, Madeline. That is what I am offering. It's generous given the terms of the agreement, and it is the only offer you will receive. If you choose to contest it, we will be in litigation for 3 years. You will spend every dollar you have on lawyers, and you will still lose, because I have the document, and I have Gerald. And I have 6 other attorneys in this building who are very good at their jobs." She looked at her hands folded on the table. 19 years. She had built her entire life around this man. She had turned down a position at a Boston architecture firm the year they married because Ethan said he needed her in New York. She had hosted every dinner, managed every social appearance, remembered the name of every investor's wife and every client's child. She had been his partner in every room that mattered and his ghost in every room that counted. And now he was offering her $32,000 and a signature. "What about the apartment on Riverside?" she asked. "Corporate asset." "The cottage in Connecticut. Corporate asset." "The account my mother left me when she died." A small pause. Ethan glanced at Gerald. Gerald said the funds from that account were commingled with joint marital assets in 2019. "Under New York law, that was my mother's money," Madeline said. Her voice did not shake, but something moved behind her eyes that was not grief and not anger. It was something colder than both. She saved that money her entire life. She lived in the same house for 40 years, and she wore the same winter coat for 15 of them because she didn't believe in waste. And she left it to me, not to a joint account, not to Ethan Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore, she worked as a school librarian for 31 years, Madeline said, and her voice was steady and precise. She made $38,000 a year at her highest salary, and she saved $112,000 because she was careful and she was patient and she believed in the future. She paused. You are telling me that money belongs to him. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Madeline, do not make this harder than it needs to be. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and picked up the pen. Gerald began to speak something about taking her time reviewing the documents, but she wasn't listening. She turned the pages until she reached the signature line, and she signed her name in one clean motion, the same way she had always done everything in this marriage, quietly, completely, without complaint. She set the pen down. She picked up her bag. She stood. Ethan said nothing. Gerald said, "We will process the wire transfer within 3 business days to the account on file." The account on file was a checking account she'd had since college, and it currently held $14 and some odd cents. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Ethan say to Gerald in a voice that did not bother to lower itself, "Have Monica call the florist. The Riverside apartment needs the winter arrangements changed before Saturday." Monica was 29 years old. Madeline knew this because she had found the credit card statement 6 months ago and had spent 3 weeks quietly confirming what she already understood was true. She pushed through the glass door and walked past the receptionist and pressed the elevator button and stood with her back straight and her face composed until the doors opened and then closed behind her. She stood alone in the elevator. The number above the door counted down from 42. She breathed in. She breathed out. At the lobby, the elevator opened and she walked through the marble corridor and pushed out through the revolving door, and the rain hit her immediately cold and sideways. And she had no umbrella because she had forgotten it in the car, and the car was Ethan's car, and she had taken a cab this morning because she had not wanted to arrive at her own divorce proceeding asking her husband for a ride. She stood on the sidewalk in the rain with her handbag over her arm, and she did not move for almost a full minute. A man in a suit walked around her. A woman with a stroller gave her a look of mild concern and then moved on. A cab splashed through a puddle 6 inches from her feet and soaked the hem of her coat. She opened her purse. She had $32 in cash and a Metro card with 2 trips left on it. She had a phone with a cracked screen because she had dropped it 3 weeks ago and had told herself she would get it fixed after the divorce was settled. She had a small rolling suitcase that she had packed that morning with what she could fit before the housekeeper arrived because she had not trusted herself to be in that apartment when Ethan came home. She had no credit cards. The cards had been in the joint account, and Gerald had explained in his careful, practiced way that joint credit access would be suspended pending finalization. She pulled out her phone and typed in the name of the cheapest motel she could recall seeing advertised on the subway, and she started walking toward the nearest station, suitcase bumping behind her over the wet sidewalk rain, flattening her hair against her forehead. She did not cry. She made a decision somewhere in that elevator that she was not going to cry. Not yet. Not until she had a door between herself and this city and this day. And maybe not even then. The subway was crowded and hot, and someone bumped her suitcase twice without apologizing. She stood with one hand on the pole and her bag tucked against her chest, and she thought about her mother's money. She thought about the number $112,000, and she thought about the winter coat and the $38,000 a year and the 31 years and the careful, patient belief in the future. She thought he took that too. She got off at the right stop and walked 4 blocks through the rain to the Fairfield Motor Inn, which had a sign missing 2 letters in its name and a lobby that smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee. The man behind the desk charged her $68 for 3 nights, which was a special, he said, and she paid it in cash and took the key to room 7 and dragged her suitcase down the external walkway through the rain and unlocked the door and went inside. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She looked at the wall. She had $32 in her purse. Minus the $68 for the room meant she was now negative $36, except that was impossible because she had given the man the cash and had it accepted. But in any real sense, she had nothing. She had 3 nights and an empty stomach and a cracked phone and the clothes on her back and whatever was in the suitcase. She opened the suitcase. She had packed her good black dress, which was useless, 2 pairs of slacks, 3 blouses, Her grandmother's silver earrings, which were the only jewelry she owned outright, purchased before the marriage. A photograph of her mother. Her college diploma, which she had taken off the wall of the home office on impulse that morning, and had not quite understood why until right now. She held the diploma, Columbia School of Architecture, 1994, magna cum laude. She had been 22 years old, and she had been brilliant, and she had been so certain of the shape of her future. She set the diploma down beside her on the bed, and she pulled out her phone and she started making calls. The first call was to her old colleague, Patricia Webb, who had gone to work for a mid-size firm in Midtown after they both graduated. Patricia picked up on the third ring, and her voice was warm and then gradually careful. "Madeline. Oh, I heard. I'm so sorry." "I need work, Patricia. Anything, even drafting, even assistant level. I don't care about title right now. I need income." A pause. "I'll talk to David. I'll see what's open. Can I call you back tomorrow?" "Yes, please." The second call was to a woman named Rosalind Chen, who ran a small interior design consultancy and had once told Madeline at a fundraiser that she had always admired her eye, and that if she ever wanted to collaborate, the door was open. Rosalind's assistant said Ms. Chen was unavailable, and would she like to leave a voicemail? She left a voicemail. She called 3 more people over the next hour. One did not answer. One answered and spoke to her for 4 minutes with increasing discomfort before saying he would need to think about it. One answered warmly and then became suddenly evasive when Madeline mentioned that she was no longer affiliated with the Whitmore household. That last one stung more than the others. She set her phone down and looked at the ceiling. She understood then what Ethan had done. Not just the prenuptial agreement and the commingled accounts and the corporate asset designations. All of that was the legal architecture of erasure carefully built over years by a man who planned everything. But the other thing, the softer, more thorough destruction. He had made her a social satellite. Every person she knew had first known him. Every connection she had, every room she had access to, every phone number in her contacts, they were all attached to the orbit of Ethan Whitmore. And now that she had left that orbit or been expelled from it, she was not a person with a network. She was a woman with a list of contacts who had all received a very specific version of the story from a man with considerably more power than she currently possessed. She thought about his voice in that conference room. "Very careful about burning what goodwill I have left to offer you." He had already made calls. She understood that now. He had already told the story his way. He had already moved the pieces before she even picked up the pen. She lay back on the motel bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling, and she breathed carefully in and out, and she thought, what do I actually have? She had her degree. She had 19 years of experience managing the aesthetics, the logistics, the relationships of a billion-dollar social world. She had a mind that had been underused for nearly 2 decades and was still underneath all of it sharp. She had her grandmother's earrings. She had a photograph of her mother. She had a diploma that meant something even if no one in the city was going to answer her calls tomorrow. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. At 5 in the morning, she got up and sat at the small desk by the window and opened her phone's browser and started researching employment law in New York State. She read for 2 hours. She did not know exactly what she was looking for. She only knew that the prenuptial agreement was forged and that forging a legal document was a crime, and that she had no money to hire an attorney, and that there had to be a door somewhere in this wall, even if she couldn't see it yet. At 7, she went to the motel office and asked the man behind the desk if there was somewhere nearby she could get coffee. He pointed her to a bodega 2 blocks east. She walked there in the cold morning air with $4 in her pocket and bought a small coffee and a roll and stood outside on the sidewalk and drank it while the city woke up around her. A woman across the street was opening a flower shop. A man in a hard hat was eating breakfast from a paper bag on the hood of a work truck. A bus went by with an advertisement for a law firm on its side. "Personal injury class action, we fight for you." And she looked at it and thought about Arthur Pendleton. She did not know anyone named Arthur Pendleton. The name had not occurred to her. She was simply standing on a sidewalk in the cold, thinking about a bus advertisement, and the name arrived in her mind like something she had always known and then immediately dismissed because there was no such person and she had no such connection, and this was simply a desperate brain looking for exits that did not exist. She finished her coffee. She walked back to the motel. She sat down on the bed and picked up her phone and opened her contacts and went through every name one by one, slowly looking for anything she had overlooked or underestimated. She had done this twice already, but she did it again because she was a woman who believed in thoroughness. She found nothing new. She set the phone down. She picked up the photograph of her mother. Her mother's name had been Frances Carter, and she had been a woman of extraordinary patience and very little drama. She had not cried at Madeline's father's funeral, not because she didn't grieve, but because, as she explained later, she had learned a long time ago that the time for tears was private, and the time for public composure was when you needed people to take you seriously. Madeline had not understood that until right now. She set the photograph against the wall where she could see it from the bed. She thought about the wedding ring on her finger. She had not taken it off yet. It was a 3-carat round diamond in a platinum setting that Ethan had presented to her in the garden of his parents' estate in Connecticut on a Sunday morning in June 20 years ago. She had worn it every day since. She had worn it through childbirth scares that turned out to be false alarms, and through the year he worked in Singapore and only came home once, and through every dinner party and every charity gala, and every morning when she made coffee in a kitchen that cost more than most people's houses. She twisted it off now. It came off easily. Her fingers had thinned over the past several months. She had not noticed until this moment. She held the ring up in the gray morning light from the window. It was heavy, or it had always felt heavy. Now holding it for what she understood was the last time she noticed that it was lighter than she expected. She put it in the inside pocket of her purse. She thought, I can sell this. It won't be enough, but it will be something. It will be a direction. She lay back, and this time she did sleep briefly, and without dreaming, and when she woke, the clock on her phone said 10:47, and she had missed one call from Patricia Webb. She called back immediately. Patricia's voice was different, tighter. Madeline, I spoke with David. And a breath. There's nothing open right now. He says the team is full. Patricia. 2 weeks ago, David told me at the Guggenheim benefit that he was desperate for senior talent. I know. You know. Madeline. He called you, didn't he? Ethan called him. The silence on the other end was its own answer. I'm sorry, Patricia said, and she sounded like she meant it, which almost made it worse. Madeline hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand and looked at it and understood fully and completely that this was not going to be a matter of making more calls. This was not a networking problem. This was a calculated wall built quietly over the past weeks or months by a man who understood power as a system and had the resources to operate every lever of it. He had not just taken her money, he had taken her name. She thought about the ring in her purse. She pulled it out. She looked at it again. There was something wrong with the weight. She had been aware of it and had not let herself think about it, and now she let herself think about it. 3 carats of round, brilliant cut diamond should have a particular heft. She had held enough of her friends' rings over the years, had helped enough of them select settings, had spent enough time adjacent to the world of fine jewelry to know what that weight felt like. This did not feel like that. She took the ring to a jeweler 3 blocks from the motel. She had passed it on the way to the bodega, a small shop with a single glass case and a sign above the door that said, Kowalski's Fine Jewelry Established 1987. The man behind the counter was in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He took the ring from her without ceremony and put it under a loupe and looked at it for about 45 seconds and then set it down on the counter between them. Cubic zirconia, he said. Good quality, very well cut. Somebody paid a fair amount for this, but it's not a diamond. She looked at the ring. Are you certain? He put it back under the loupe and looked again. Completely. No inclusion's refractive index is off densities wrong. I can run a thermal conductivity test if you want confirmation. She shook her head. She picked up the ring. She put it in her pocket. She walked back out onto the street and stood there in the cold air and breathed. He had given her a fake ring, not just at the end, not a recent substitution. She thought back, tried to remember, wondered if there had been a switch somewhere over the years, a moment when the real stone had been replaced. But she knew she understood with quiet and nauseating clarity that Ethan Whitmore did not do things by accident. He did not make oversights. He planned. And a man who had forged a prenuptial agreement 8 months before his wedding was entirely capable of selecting a very convincing piece of costume jewelry for the proposal and presenting it in a Connecticut garden to a woman too overwhelmed with emotion to think about refractive indices. He had never given her a real diamond. He had given her a performance of a diamond. She stood on the sidewalk, and the grief that she had been holding at bay since the elevator, since the rain, since the conference room table, since the moment he slid those papers across without looking at her, that grief arrived finally in full. But it did not break her. It did something else. It moved through her like a wave through stone, present acknowledged and then gone. And what was left behind was not sadness and not anger and not despair. It was something clean and cold and very, very still. She put the cubic zirconia ring back in her pocket. She walked back to the motel. She sat down at the desk. She picked up her phone. She did not make any more calls to old contacts. She did not look for job listings. She opened the legal research browser tab that she had left open at 5 in the morning, and she went back to where she had stopped reading, and she started again slowly and thoroughly, and this time she was not searching without direction. She was looking for the door. She did not know yet what it looked like. She did not know its name or its dimensions or which wall it was hidden in. But she had spent 19 years in a marriage to a man who believed that control was the same thing as power, and she had spent this morning with a jeweler who had looked at something that appeared to be one thing and identified it precisely and without drama as something else entirely. She understood now that the same principle applied here. Everything Ethan had shown her, the settlement, the prenuptial agreement, the wealth, the ring, had been a performance. A very convincing, very expensive, very well-planned performance. And performances, she thought, have an architecture. And architecture has points of failure. She read until the light outside the window changed, and the motel's single parking lot lamp flickered on in the early dark. And she had not eaten since the roll at 7 in the morning, and she did not notice. She read. And somewhere in the city, 27 floors above street level, in an office she did not know, existed a man named Arthur Pendleton was holding a file with her name on it. He had been holding it for 3 days. He had been waiting for exactly the right moment to make a call. He looked at his phone. He looked at the file. He dialed. The phone rang 4 times before she answered it. She had been asleep or something close to it. The thin, shallow half-sleep of a person whose mind refuses to fully release, and the sound pulled her up sharp, and she grabbed the phone off the nightstand before she was fully awake, some buried reflex hoping it was Patricia calling back with better news, or anyone calling back with any news at all. The number on the screen was unknown. She answered anyway. Mrs. Whitmore, Carter, she said automatically. Madeline Carter. A brief pause on the other end. Then with what she registered as genuine respect. Of course, Miss Carter, my name is Arthur Pendleton. I apologize for the late hour. I was wondering if we might speak. She sat up and looked at the clock. It was 11:47 at night. She had been asleep for less than an hour. How did you get this number? She asked. I have been attempting to locate you for several days, he said. I understand this call is unexpected. I also understand that you are likely exhausted and that this is not an ideal time, but I would ask you to give me 3 minutes, Ms. Carter. What I have to tell you is something you will want to hear. She did not hang up. She pulled her knees to her chest and sat in the dark of the motel room with the cracked phone against her ear, and she said, 3 minutes. Go. Not tonight, he said quietly. Not over the phone. I would ask you to meet me in person. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. I have an office on Lexington at 53rd, 9 o'clock. What is this regarding? A pause. It is regarding your legal standing, Ms. Carter, and a matter that affects you far more significantly than you currently understand. She pressed the phone tighter against her ear. Can you give me anything more specific than that? I can tell you, he said carefully, that what happened to you in that conference room yesterday was not the end of this story. I can tell you that Ethan Whitmore made a mistake 19 years ago that he has never corrected, and that the correction is entirely in your hands. The room was completely silent. She sat there and she breathed. 9 o'clock, she said. I'll have coffee, he said. And then before she could ask anything else, get some rest, Miss Carter. Tomorrow changes things considerably. He ended the call. She sat in the dark for a very long time. She did not sleep again that night. She lay on top of the covers with her eyes open and her mind running, turning the call over and looking at it from every angle, looking for the trap. Because there was always a trap. She had learned that now. She had learned it in a conference room on the 42nd floor with a forged document and a man who checked his watch while 19 years dissolved around him. But she went to the address at 9 o'clock. Because what else was she going to do? The office on Lexington was small by Manhattan standards, a single suite on the 18th floor of an older building, not the gleaming tower kind, the solid pre-war kind that smelled like old paper and central heat. The reception area had 2 chairs and a woman in her 50s who looked up when Madeline walked in and said simply, "Miss Carter, go right through." Arthur Pendleton was a man of perhaps 70, with white hair cut close to his head, and the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where the wrong word destroys everything. He stood when she entered and gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited until she sat before he sat, and he did not offer pleasantries. He opened a folder. In 2005, he said, 19 years ago, 5 months before you married Ethan Whitmore, a shell company was established in Delaware under the name Apex Solutions, LLC. The company was registered to hold the core intellectual property of an AI optimization system that Ethan Whitmore had been developing over the prior 3 years. The system, which at the time existed only as a prototype, was assigned to Apex Solutions pending patent approval. Madeline listened. The patent was approved in 2007. Pendleton continued. At that point, Apex Solutions held the controlling intellectual property over what would eventually become the foundation of Ethan Whitmore's entire technology portfolio. Every product line, every licensing agreement, every subsidiary, all of it sits on top of that original patent. "I don't understand what this has to do with me," Madeline said. Arthur Pendleton turned the folder toward her. "Because you," he said, "are the sole registered owner of Apex Solutions, LLC." The silence in the room was absolute. She looked at the document. Her name was there, Madeline Frances Carter, her social security number. Her signature, this one, she was almost certain genuine, though she could not immediately place the memory. "That's not possible," she said. "It is not only possible," Pendleton said. "It is the legal reality. When Ethan Whitmore established Apex Solutions, he placed it in your name. It is our belief that he intended this as a tax and liability structure, placing the IP in the name of a private individual rather than a corporate entity provided certain early-stage advantages. He intended to transfer it back to his own holding company once the patent was approved. But for reasons we have not been able to fully establish, that transfer never occurred." She stared at the document. "He forgot?" she said slowly. "Or he believed it was handled when it was not," Pendleton said. "Or the attorney who was meant to execute the transfer made an error. The reason is in the current circumstances immaterial. The legal reality is this Apex Solutions LLC has never been transferred out of your name. You are its sole owner of record. And Apex Solutions holds the foundational patent on which Ethan Whitmore's entire business empire rests." She looked at him. "Without your signature on a transfer document." Pendleton said his legal claim to that IP is unenforceable. She breathed in very carefully. "How is this only coming to light now?" "It isn't entirely," Pendleton said. "I have been aware of this situation for some time. I represented a former business partner of Mr. Whitmore's in a dispute several years ago, and the structure of Apex Solutions came to my attention during that proceeding. At the time, the information was not relevant to my client's case, but I retained the documentation. When I heard what happened at your divorce proceeding—" "How did you hear about my divorce proceeding?" A small pause. "Manhattan is a smaller city than it appears," he said, "and I have been watching the situation for some time, waiting to see whether you would need this information." She looked at him steadily. "And now you've decided I need it." "I think," he said carefully, "that what you need right now is the truth. What you do with it is entirely your decision." She looked back at the folder. "There's something else," she said. It wasn't a question. Pendleton turned to the next page. Whitmore Capital has filed for an initial public offering, he said. The IPO is scheduled to price in 11 days. At current projections, the offering would value the company at $3.4 billion. She set the folder down on the desk. Without a clear title to the Apex Solutions patent, Pendleton said the IPO cannot proceed. The underwriters require clean IP documentation. If the ownership dispute becomes public before pricing the offering collapses, the institutional investors withdraw, the valuation disappears. She sat in the chair in the small pre-war office, and she looked at the man across the desk, and she thought about the ring in her pocket, and her mother's money, and the conference room, and the Rolex, and the way he had said without looking at her, "Have Monica call the florist." "And if the IPO collapses," she said. "His debt obligations come due immediately," Pendleton said. "His lines of credit are leveraged against the projected offering proceeds. Without the capital event, he is technically insolvent within 60 days. The room was very quiet. She said, "What do you want from me, Mr. Pendleton?" He met her eyes. "Nothing, yeah," he said. "I want nothing from you. I am telling you this because you deserve to know it, because what happened to you in that room was a fraud. The prenuptial agreement was a fraud. The settlement was designed to prevent you from discovering this, and I believe you should understand what you actually hold before you decide how to proceed." She looked at him for a long time. "Who else knows about this?" "My associate and myself," he said. "No one connected to Whitmore, not yet." She picked up the folder. She read the documents for 22 minutes in silence. Pendleton sat across from her and drank his coffee and did not speak. When she finished, she set the folder down and said, "I need 3 days." He nodded. "The clock is moving, Miss Carter. He will be aware of the vulnerability when the underwriters run their final IP review. That review is scheduled for day 8. That gives you 3 days," she said again. "I need to understand what I'm holding before I decide what to do with it, and I need to think." He nodded. She stood, picked up her bag, and then paused at the door. "Why did he put it in my name?" she asked. "Not of Pendleton exactly, just aloud." "He was the most careful man I have ever known. He planned everything. Why did he put the most important asset he had in someone else's name and then forget to take it back?" Pendleton considered this. "In my experience," he said, "the most controlled people sometimes make the largest errors precisely because they trust their own systems too completely. He built a structure and assumed it would be maintained automatically, and you were not in his understanding a variable he needed to account for." She stood in the doorway. "He didn't think I would ever need to be looked at," she said. "He thought," Pendleton said quietly, "that you were safe." She walked out. She rode the elevator down 18 floors with the folder tucked under her arm, and she stepped out onto Lexington Avenue, and the cold hit her, and she stood on the sidewalk, and for the first time in 3 days, she felt something that was not fear and not grief and not the cold, clean determination she had been using to hold herself together. She felt the faint beginning of something that might eventually become power, but she did not let herself feel it fully. Not yet, not until she understood it completely. Because the worst thing she could do right now was act from emotion when she finally had the advantage of information. She went back to the motel. She spread the documents across the desk. She started reading again. 3 hours later, her phone rang. "Patricia Webb," she answered. "I want you to know," Patricia said without preamble, "that David did receive a call. I don't know all the details, but I heard enough of his side of the conversation to know it was deliberate. Madeline, he's making calls. Ethan, he's telling people things." "What kind of things?" Patricia hesitated. "That you were unstable during the marriage, that there were mental health concerns, that the divorce was complicated by your behavior." Madeline closed her eyes. "Patricia, you know me." "I know you," Patricia said firmly. "That's why I'm calling. I don't care what David says. If you need a reference, you call me directly. My personal cell, not through the office." "Thank you." "Madeline," Patricia's voice dropped. "Be careful. I don't know exactly what he's doing, but it's coordinated. It didn't come from one place." She already knew this, but hearing it confirmed from outside her own head made it land differently. "Thank you, Patricia," she said. "Truly." She hung up. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up the folder again. The job interviews started 2 days after the meeting with Pendleton. She went to them because she needed income. Regardless of what the legal situation held, she could not assume anything, could not spend money she didn't have, could not build plans on a foundation she hadn't yet tested. The first interview was at a mid-size architectural consultancy in Chelsea. The hiring partner was a man named Douglas Hart, who had gone to Yale 2 years after her Columbia graduation, and who during the first 7 minutes of the conversation was engaged, interested, clearly impressed by her portfolio summary. Then his assistant knocked and handed him a note. His expression did not change visibly, but something behind his eyes shifted. "I appreciate your time today, Ms. Carter," he said. "We have a few more candidates to consider. We'll be in touch." "Mr. Hart," she said, "whatever that note said, I'd like to address it." He folded the note. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean that I believe my former husband has been making calls to professional contacts in this city, and I believe one of those calls may have preceded my interview here today. I am telling you directly that anything you have heard from Ethan Whitmore or from anyone connected to him is not accurate, and I would ask you to evaluate my professional qualifications on their own merits." Douglas Hart looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant accusation," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said. He did not offer her the position, but when she walked out with her spine straight and her voice steady, and that was something. The second interview went the same way with less subtlety. The woman conducting it actually said midway through that she had heard there were concerns about Madeline's professional conduct during her marriage, and would she like to address those concerns. "My professional conduct," Madeline said, "is documented in the charitable board appointments, the design consultancies, and the executive social coordination that I managed over 19 years. Would you like references from the directors of those boards? Because I can provide 7. The woman said she would need to think about it. She did not call back. By the end of that day, Madeline had been to 3 interviews and received 0 offers, and had spent $14 on a subway card and a meal from a deli counter, and had $31 left and 2 nights remaining on the motel. She sat on the motel bed. She looked at the cubic zirconia ring on the nightstand. She had been carrying it in her pocket, and she had stopped because the weight of it, the lightness of it, the fraudulence of it, had started to feel like something she was choosing to carry, and she didn't want to choose it anymore. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what Pendleton had said. He thought you were safe. Not dangerous, not a variable. Safe meaning contained, meaning small, meaning the kind of person whose silence can be purchased for $32,000 and a fake diamond and a forged document. She picked up the ring. She thought about 19 years of mornings making coffee in a kitchen she didn't own, 19 years of knowing every investor's wife's name and every client's child's birthday, and every table preference at every restaurant Ethan used for business dinners. 19 years of making his world run so smoothly that he never once had to think about how it ran. And she thought about how that knowledge, that deep, intimate knowledge of his world, his relationships, his patterns, was still inside her. He had not taken it. He could not take it. It was not in a joint account. It had not been commingled. It was hers completely and entirely. She set the ring back on the nightstand. She opened the legal folder. On day 5, exactly 6 days before the IPO pricing, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. 12 words. "We know you met with Arthur Pendleton. We would like to talk." She stared at the message. She did not respond. 2 hours later, the phone rang. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, early 40s, she guessed, with the clipped precision of a man who worked inside corporate legal and had never in his career needed to modulate his tone for anyone's comfort. "Ms. Carter, my name is not relevant at this point. I'm calling on behalf of Whitmore Capital. We understand you've been in contact with Arthur Pendleton. We'd like to discuss what that conversation entailed." "I don't think I'm interested in that discussion," she said. "Ms. Carter, Mr. Whitmore is prepared to offer a revised settlement, significantly revised. He's prepared to acknowledge that there may have been some administrative complications in the finalization of your divorce agreement, and he would like to make that right in a way that benefits everyone." "Administrative complications," she repeated. The revised offer would include a cash payment of $1.2 million wired immediately upon signature and full cessation of any professional communications that may have affected your employment prospects. She sat very still. $1.2 million. 3 days ago, she had $32 in her purse. The number landed in her chest with a physical weight. She thought about the motel room, the bodega coffee, the interviews that evaporated the moment a note was passed. She breathed. "Tell me something," she said. "Of course." "When he sent you to make this call, did he tell you what he did to the prenuptial agreement?" A pause that lasted just slightly too long. "I'm not sure I understand the question." "Did he tell you about the patent structure on Apex Solutions? Did he explain to you what that company holds and who currently owns it?" The line went very quiet. "I'll take your silence as a no," she said. "Tell him to call me himself, not through an intermediary. If he wants to have this conversation, he can have it with me directly." She ended the call. Her hand was shaking. She pressed it flat against the desk, and she breathed until it stopped. She was not a lawyer. She was not a businesswoman in the conventional sense. She was a 51-year-old woman in a motel room with $31 and a cracked phone and a folder of documents she barely fully understood. But she had spent 19 years learning how Ethan Whitmore thought. She knew his patterns better than anyone alive. She knew that he never sent someone to do something he valued, only things he considered beneath him. And she knew that $1.2 million was not generosity. It was panic wearing the costume of generosity. He was scared. That was the thing she kept returning to, the thing she had not allowed herself to fully feel until right now, sitting in room 7 of the Fairfield Motor Inn, with rain beginning again outside the window, the same rain as the day this started. He was scared of her. Not of her power exactly. He still believed she suspected that she was disorganized and overwhelmed and likely to make an emotional decision. He was scared of the document, of the company, of the clean, legal, inarguable fact of her name on a paper he had stopped thinking about 19 years ago. She opened her laptop, a second-hand one she had purchased for $80 from a pawn shop on her second day in the motel, using the last of a small cash advance from one of her credit cards before the access was suspended. And she pulled up the publicly filed documents for the Whitmore Capital IPO. She read the prospectus for 4 hours. She understood roughly 60% of it. She called Pendleton in the morning. "They made an offer," she said. $1.2 million. A pause. "That is a significant number," he said carefully. "It's fear," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." "What happens to the IPO if I say nothing? If I simply do nothing, and the underwriters run their IP review and discover the Apex Solutions ownership structure?" Pendleton was quiet for a moment. "It depends on how the underwriters handle the discovery. Best case for Whitmore. They identify it internally. The IPO is delayed while he scrambles to resolve it. Worst case, it becomes public. The SEC filings contain representations about IP ownership. If those representations are materially inaccurate, it's fraud," she said. "It is a significant exposure," he said carefully. Whether it rises to fraud depends on intent on when he knew on a number of factors that would be resolved in litigation. She thought about that. "He always knew," she said. "He's Ethan Whitmore. He doesn't not know things. He made a mistake and he buried it, and then he decided that divorcing me quietly and erasing me was cleaner than correcting it." Pendleton did not respond to that directly, which was its own kind of answer. She looked out the window at the wet parking lot. "I'm not signing anything for $1.2 million, she said. "Miss Carter, I built 19 years of my life into that empire. My mother's money went into joint accounts that funded his early ventures. Every contact he leveraged, every dinner he hosted, every relationship he maintained, I built those. I was the infrastructure, and I did it because I believed in the partnership." She paused. $1.2 million is what he pays someone to go away. I am not someone going away." Pendleton was quiet. "What are you thinking, Ms. Carter?" he asked. She looked at the folder on the desk, at her name on the page, Madeline Frances Carter, sole registered owner. "I'm thinking," she said, "that it's time he came to the table himself." She picked up the cubic zirconia ring from the nightstand. She held it up in the morning light. It caught the light the way a diamond would, almost exactly. Beautiful and perfectly calibrated and entirely false. She thought about this prospectus, the IPO. $3.4 billion built on a patent that lived in her name in a Delaware filing cabinet. She thought about her mother in the same winter coat for 15 years. She set the ring back down. She picked up her phone. She called Pendleton back. "I want to meet with him," she said. "Not his attorney, not a representative, him. And I want to choose the location." "Miss Carter, are you certain you want to?" "He thinks," she said, "that the difference between us is that he has resources and I don't. He thinks the settlement was a conclusion. I want him to understand that it was a beginning, and I want him to understand that sitting across a table from me." A pause. "I'll reach out," Pendleton said. She hung up. She stood up from the desk. She walked to the small mirror above the motel dresser, and she looked at herself. The circles under her eyes, the slightly hollow quality of a person running on adrenaline and bodega, rolls the hair she had pinned back without products because she had not packed products. She looked at herself for a long time. She thought about the garden in Connecticut, the Sunday morning in June, the ring in a velvet box, and a man on one knee, and a woman who believed everything she was seeing was real. She thought about what she knew now that she didn't know then. She thought about what he was going to see when he sat down across from her in whatever room she chose, expecting to find the woman from the elevator, the woman from the rain, the woman he had already disposed of and moved past. She was not that woman anymore. She was not sure she had ever been that woman, not entirely. She thought maybe she had been somewhere underneath it the whole time. The magna cum laude who turned down Boston, the daughter of a librarian who wore the same coat for 15 years, the woman who had signed those papers quietly and walked out with her spine straight, because she had known even then that the papers were not the end. She straightened her hair. She picked up the folder. She picked up her phone. And outside in the wet parking lot, the morning was already moving, the city already turning, and somewhere in a glass tower on the Upper West Side, Ethan Whitmore had just received a message from his attorney that said 3 words. She said no, and the first crack appeared in the foundation of everything he had built on her silence. The message came back through Pendleton in less than 2 hours. That speed told her everything. A man who is not afraid takes his time. A man who is not afraid lets the other side wait, lets silence do the work, lets the power differential speak for itself. Ethan Whitmore had spent his entire career understanding exactly that principle. He had used it in boardrooms and courtrooms and across dinner tables for 30 years. The fact that his response came back in under 2 hours meant he was no longer operating from strength. Pendleton called at 11:40 in the morning, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in their previous conversations, something cautious underneath the professional calm. "He will meet," Pendleton said. "His attorney has proposed a private conference room at their office, the day after tomorrow, 9 in the morning." "No," she said. A pause. "Ms. Carter, his office, his territory, his table. That is not a meeting. That is a surrender choreographed to look like a negotiation." She had thought about this. She had lain awake thinking about very little else. "I will choose the location, and it will not be a law office. He will not agree to anything without legal counsel present. He can bring counsel. I don't care who is in the room. I care where the room is." Another pause. She could hear Pendleton thinking. "What location did you have in mind?" he asked. She had been thinking about this since the night before turning it over, testing different ideas against what she knew of Ethan's psychology. He needed to feel in control even when he wasn't. He performed dominance the way other men breathed automatically without thought. Any location that was visibly neutral would feel to him like a concession he could spin. He needed something that would work on him at a level below the conscious. "There's a diner on 44th and 9th, she said. "Lou's. It's been there since 1971. We went there once years ago, before the money, before the company. We had coffee at the counter, and he told me about the AI patent system he was developing, and I told him it was going to change everything." She paused. "He remembers that. He has a very precise memory. He will know exactly what I am saying by choosing that place." Pendleton was quiet. "You want him off balance," he said. "I want him human," she said. "I want him in a room where he cannot perform being Ethan Whitmore because the room doesn't accommodate the performance. I want him sitting across from me without the architecture of his power around him." "He will try to refuse. Tell his attorney to explain the IPO timeline to him again," she said, "and then ask him again." Ethan agreed by 3 o'clock that afternoon. She knew he would. She hung up and sat with the folder in her lap, and she allowed herself for exactly 30 seconds to feel the thing she had been holding back. Not triumph. It was too early for that, and she had learned viscerally and at great cost not to celebrate positions that hadn't yet been tested. But something close to it. The feeling of a gear catching. The feeling of something that had been locked beginning very slowly to turn. Then she closed the folder and went back to work. She spent the rest of that day and most of the following one doing something she had not done in 19 years. She called people who owed her nothing and asked them for help. Not the social contacts, not the professional network that Ethan had poisoned. She went further back. College classmates, architecture professors she had stayed tangentially in touch with through alumni newsletters. A woman named Gloria Reyes, who had been her closest friend in graduate school and who now ran a legal aid nonprofit in Brooklyn, and who, when Madeline finally tracked down her direct number and explained in clean, precise terms what had happened, said without hesitation, "Tell me what you need." What she needed, she explained, was someone to review the Apex Solutions documents with her and confirm her understanding of her legal position before she walked into that diner. Gloria was not a corporate IP attorney, but she knew people who were. She made 4 calls in the time it took Madeline to drink a cup of coffee, and by 7 that evening, Madeline was on the phone with a man named James Okafor, who was a partner at a firm that specialized in IP litigation, and who spent 1 hour and 19 minutes walking her through the exact contours of what she held. His verdict was precise. "The ownership is clean," he said. "There is no ambiguity in the filing. You are the sole registered owner of Apex Solutions, LLC. The patent assignment to Apex Solutions is recorded and searchable. And because Apex Solutions is not and never has been listed as a subsidiary of Whitmore Capital in any regulatory filing, anyone representing that the IP is clear for the purposes of an IPO has either made a significant oversight or has deliberately misrepresented the structure." "Which do you think it is?" she asked. A brief pause. "I think," he said, "that a man who built a company on this patent for 19 years without correcting the ownership structure made a choice." "Thank you," she said. "Ms. Carter." His voice was careful. "What he held over you in that divorce proceeding, the prenuptial agreement, it was forged," she said. "If you can establish that the settlement is voidable, everything signed under duress or fraud is challengeable. But that's a separate proceeding and a separate timeline from whatever you're about to walk into." "I know," she said. "One thing at a time." She ended the call. She wrote 3 pages of notes in a lined notebook she had bought for $2 at the bodega. Not scripts. She was not going to script the conversation because scripted people lose when the other person goes off script, and Ethan would go off script deliberately looking for the seam. She wrote facts. Clean, numbered, legally verified facts in the order she intended to use them. And then she wrote at the bottom of the 3rd page in her own shorthand what he thinks this is, and underneath that, what it actually is. What he thought this was a renegotiation, a woman who had found a piece of leverage and was going to use it to extract a larger settlement. He would come to that diner expecting to buy her out at a higher price, expecting that the right number, 2 million, 3 million, whatever it took, would end this cleanly. He would bring his attorney to handle the legal language, and he would bring his checkbook and his patience and his absolute certainty that everything in life has a price, because in his experience everything did. What it actually was, the end of his ability to execute the IPO under current conditions, the potential exposure of fraud in both the IP structure and the divorce settlement, and a woman who was no longer interested in being purchased. She read those 2 lines over. She closed the notebook. She did not sleep much that night either. But it was a different kind of wakefulness, not the desperate circling anxiety of the first nights in the motel, but the focused, quiet alertness of a person who knows exactly what is coming and has decided who they are going to be when it arrives. The morning of the meeting, she was up at 5:30. She showered. She put on the best of the 3 blouses she had packed, a deep charcoal silk that she had bought years ago for a board presentation and that still fit perfectly. She put on her grandmother's silver earrings. She did her hair with the limited tools she had, and she looked at herself in the mirror and she thought, "This is enough. This is exactly enough." She arrived at Lou's Diner at 8:47. She chose a booth in the middle of the room, not a corner, not a window seat, not anywhere that could be construed as either exposed or sheltered. She sat down and ordered coffee, and she waited. Ethan arrived at 9:03, which was deliberate. She knew it was deliberate. 6 minutes late was his standard calibration for expressing that his time was the more valuable commodity. He came in with Gerald Foss at his shoulder and a man she didn't recognize who carried a briefcase and had the look of a junior attorney deployed to take notes. Ethan looked around the diner once. His expression did not change, but she saw the slight adjustment behind his eyes when he registered the location, the Formica tables, the coffee cups, the smell of eggs and toast, and 40 years of the same routine. He registered it, and he filed it, and he did not let it touch his face. He slid into the booth across from her. Gerald and the junior attorney pulled 2 chairs from a neighboring table. For a moment, nobody spoke. Ethan looked at her. She looked at him. She noticed in a way she had not allowed herself in the conference room because she had been in shock that he looked older than she remembered. Not older than he was. She knew exactly how old he was. She had attended every birthday for 19 years, but older than the person she carried in her mind. The perfectly assembled armor of his expensive suit and his close haircut and his precise posture could not quite cover the fact that he had not been sleeping well. There were shadows she recognized. She had her own. "Madeline," he said. "Ethan," she said. Gerald cleared his throat. "Perhaps we might begin by—" "In a moment," Ethan said without looking at him. He was still looking at her. "I want a moment." Gerald subsided. Ethan leaned back slightly in the booth, and he looked at her with the expression she knew best from him, the one that said he was calculating, processing, deciding which version of himself this situation required. "You look well," he said. "You look tired," she said. A micro-expression moved across his face, something that in another man she might have called a flinch. "You chose this place deliberately," he said. "Yes." "We were 26 years old," he said. "You had a hole in your coat. I had $40 in my wallet and I ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, and then I had to borrow $5 from you to cover the tip." She remembered. She had forgotten that she remembered, and then the memory arrived whole and sudden. He had been so embarrassed. It had been one of the only times she had ever seen him embarrassed, and she had thought then that it was the most honest thing she had ever seen from him. "You never paid me back," she said. Something shifted in his face. For exactly 1 second, one clean, unguarded second, he looked like the man from that story. The man with $40 and a borrowed $5 and something to prove. Then the armor came back. "Madeline," he said, "I understand you've been speaking with Arthur Pendleton." "I have. And I understand that he has shared certain documents with you that pertain to the early IP structure of the company." "He has." "Then you understand," Ethan said, and his voice was very controlled, "that what you are holding is not what it appears to be. The Apex solution structure was an administrative framework. It was always intended to be transferred. The fact that the paperwork was never completed does not constitute a legitimate ownership claim." She looked at him. "James Okafor disagrees," she said. The name landed. She watched it land. Gerald's pen stopped moving. The junior attorney's head came up. Ethan's jaw tightened by a fraction. James Okafor was, she had learned from Gloria the previous evening, one of the 3 or 4 most respected IP litigators in the state. He had won cases against Fortune 500 companies. His name in this context was not a name, it was a declaration of seriousness. "You retained Okafor," Ethan said. "I spoke with Okafor," she said. "The distinction may matter to you later." Gerald leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, regardless of what anyone has told you, any legal action to assert ownership of Apex Solutions would be an enormously complicated and expensive undertaking. The litigation timeline alone would encompass the IPO pricing date," she said. Gerald stopped. "By my count, She said, "You have 9 days until the IPO prices. The underwriters require clean IP documentation. If a formal ownership dispute is filed on record before the pricing date, the underwriters will pull back. The institutional investors will pull back. The offering collapses." She paused. "I have done the math, Gerald. I assume you have too." The booth was very quiet. Ethan was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read. It was not the expression from the conference room, that patient, already won composure. This was something more complicated. She thought it might have been if she gave it its proper name: respect. The reluctant, unwilling, deeply uncomfortable respect of a man confronting something he failed to anticipate. "What do you want?" he said. She had been waiting for those words for 5 days. She let them sit for a moment. "Before I answer that," she said, "I want to put something on the table between us." She reached into her bag and set the cubic zirconia ring in the center of the formica table. Ethan looked at it. 3 carats, she said. "Or that's what you told me. Do you remember what you said when you gave it to me in the garden? You said your grandmother had a diamond that she left in a safety deposit box for the woman who married you. You said this was that diamond." Ethan said nothing. "It's cubic zirconia," she said. "A jeweler on Tremont Avenue confirmed it. Very well cut, high quality. Someone spent real money on a very convincing fake." She paused. "Just like the prenuptial agreement." Gerald said, "Miss Carter, I would urge you to be careful about—" "The prenuptial agreement carries a notarized signature," she continued, speaking only to Ethan, "with my initials on every page. I have never seen that document before the day in your conference room. I did not sign it. I did not initial it. I do not know who did, but I know that I did not, and I know that you know that I did not, and I know that a handwriting analyst would confirm what I know." She paused. "Which means the settlement I signed under that agreement was obtained by fraud." The diner moved around them, a waitress refilling coffee at the next table. The bell above the door when someone came in, the low hum of a Tuesday morning in a city that did not pause for anyone's crisis. Ethan sat very still. "You are going to file suit," he said. It was not a question. "I am telling you what I have," she said. "I am not telling you yet what I intend to do with it. Those are 2 different conversations." His attorney Gerald started to speak again, and Ethan held up one hand without looking at him, and Gerald stopped. "What do you want, Madeline?" he said again. And this time, it was different. Stripped of the performance, quieter, something underneath it that sounded almost like the question was costing him something to ask. She picked up the ring from the table and put it back in her bag. "I want you to understand something first," she said. "Not as a legal position, not as a negotiating tactic. I want you to understand it as a fact." She looked at him steadily. "I built your world. I am not exaggerating, and I am not being sentimental. Every connection that became a contract, every dinner that became a partnership, every investor who trusted you because his wife trusted me, I built that. I did it because I believed we were building something together. And I did it because I am very good at it, and I did it without complaint or recognition for 19 years, because I was raised by a woman who understood that the work matters more than the credit." She paused. "And then you gave me $32,000 and a forged document and a fake diamond, and you told your colleagues I was unstable." Ethan's jaw moved. "I know about the calls," she said. "Patricia Webb, Douglas Hart. I know the language you used. Mental health concerns, complicated behavior. I know Ethan. I want you to know that I know." "Madeline, I'm not finished." Her voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "You called those people before the ink was dry on my signature. You were already on the phone before I got to the elevator. You planned it before the meeting. You built the wall before you handed me the papers, because you needed me to have nowhere to go. You needed me to be completely isolated so that I would take the settlement and disappear." She paused. "The question I keep coming back to is whether you always planned it this way, or whether the Apex Solutions issue changed your timeline." The silence stretched. Gerald shifted in his chair. And then Ethan did something she had not expected. He sent Gerald away. "Give us a few minutes," he said. "Ethan, I strongly advise—" "Gerald." His voice was flat. "Take Thomas and get coffee at the counter. I'll call you back in 10 minutes." Gerald and the junior attorney exchanged a look and stood and walked toward the counter. She watched them go. She watched Ethan watch them go. Then he turned back to her, and the performance dropped completely. Not the armor, not the calculation, but the entire architecture of control that she had lived alongside for 19 years. And what was underneath it was a tired man in a diner who had borrowed $5 for a tip 30 years ago and had spent every year since becoming someone who would never need to borrow $5 again, and had paid for that transformation with everything that had once made him human. "I didn't plan it from the beginning," he said. She said nothing. "The Apex Solutions issue, I became aware of it 4 years ago. A routine audit. My CFO flagged it. By then, the company was already leveraged against the IPO structure, and correcting it would have required disclosures that—" He stopped. "It would have been complicated. So you decided to do nothing," she said. "I decided to manage it. And managing it eventually meant managing me." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She felt something move through her. Not anger, she was past anger. Not grief that had burned through in a motel room over a jeweler's verdict and a cup of bodega coffee. Something quieter. The recognition of a thing seen clearly for the first time. "You were always afraid of me," she said softly. "Not of me personally, of what I represented. Of owing something you couldn't quantify. You could build a company and value it to the dollar. You couldn't value 19 years of someone knowing you before you were worth knowing." He looked at the table. "And that scared you," she said. "So you decided I was worth nothing, because if I was worth nothing, you didn't owe me anything, and if you didn't owe me anything, you could walk away clean." When he looked up, his eyes were flat and controlled again. The moment had closed. "My attorneys are going to argue," he said, "that the Apex Solution structure does not constitute valid ownership for the purposes of IP claim. They will argue administrative error. We will tie this up for years." "I know," she said, "but you won't have years. You'll have 9 days." He looked at her. "There is something I haven't told you yet," she said, "about Apex Solutions, about what I've done in the past 48 hours. She reached into her bag and set a second document on the table. Not the original folder, a copy with specific pages bookmarked. "I have retained James Okafor," she said. She had not retained him. She could not afford to retain him, not yet, but the word would reach Ethan as the truth it was intended to be, because within 24 hours of this meeting ending, she intended to make it true. "He has reviewed the full Apex Solution structure and has confirmed the validity of the ownership claim. He has also identified the regulatory implications for the IPO prospectus, specifically the representations made regarding IP ownership in the S-1 filing." She paused. "You told the SEC that the IP was clean." Ethan's face did not change, but his hand resting on the table pressed flat against the surface. "That filing," she said, "contains a material misrepresentation, not an oversight, a representation, signed and submitted." She let that land. "That is not a civil matter, Ethan. That is a federal matter." The word federal sat between them on the formica table like something heavy and permanent. She watched him absorb it. She watched the man who had checked his watch while 19 years dissolved sit across a diner table from the woman he had discarded and understand for the first time the shape of what he had actually done. "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "I am not here to destroy you. I am not here for revenge. I am here because what you took from me was not just money or property. You took my name. You took my professional standing. You took my mother's savings. You took 19 years and you told the world I was unstable, and then you went back to your apartment on Riverside and had Monica change the flowers." She picked up her coffee cup. "I want what is mine, not what is generous, not what is sufficient, what is mine." "And what," he said carefully, "do you consider to be yours?" She looked at him, and she told him. The number landed with a sound she could almost hear, not a gasp, not an objection, just a silence that had weight and texture and the quality of an entire future rearranging itself. Gerald was summoned back from the counter. Gerald objected. The junior attorney wrote very fast. Ethan sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face and said nothing, while his attorney objected on his behalf. She waited. She had not ordered anything except the coffee. She picked it up and drank it and waited. When Gerald finished, she said, You have until the day after tomorrow, not to negotiate, to decide. The only negotiation available is the one I have just described. If I don't have your answer by Thursday morning at 9, I file with Okafor that afternoon. The underwriters will know by Thursday evening. The IPO prices in 9 days. You are a precise man, Ethan. I don't need to do that math for you. She picked up her bag. She stood. She looked at him one final time. He was looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 19 years of knowing him. Not anger, not calculation, not the patient certainty of a man who has already won. Something she could only describe as the expression of a person seeing another person for the first time, and finding the sight of them considerably more formidable than expected. You should have paid me back the $5, she said, and she walked out of Lou's Diner onto 44th Street into the cold morning air, and she did not look back, and behind her through the glass she could hear Gerald already talking, already problem-solving, already building the argument, and she knew with a certainty that did not require confirmation that the argument was not going to hold. She pulled out her phone. She called Gloria Reyes. "I need James Okafor's direct number," she said. "And I need it today. I'm ready to retain him." "What happened?" Gloria asked. "I told him what I wanted," Madeline said. And now we wait," she said. "But not for long. He's not a patient man. He never was." She paused. "He'll call by tonight. Maybe sooner." "How do you know?" She thought about his hands flat on the table. She thought about the word federal sitting between them on the formica. She thought about a man who had built his entire empire on control, suddenly confronted with the one variable he had forgotten to account for. "Because I know him," she said. "I know him better than anyone alive, and I know that what he cannot tolerate is uncertainty. He will want this resolved before he has time to imagine all the ways it can go wrong." She was right. Ethan's attorney called at 2:17 that afternoon, not to negotiate, to ask what precisely she meant by control. She smiled. She actually smiled for the first time in 8 days, standing in the parking lot of the Fairfield Motor Inn with the cracked phone against her ear and the cold air on her face. "Tell him," she said, "that I'll explain it at the table." Gerald Foss called back at 4:51 that same afternoon, which meant Ethan had spent exactly 2.5 hours after her departure, attempting to find an alternative before concluding there wasn't one. She had expected it to take longer. The fact that it hadn't told her something important, the legal team had already run the numbers probably weeks ago, and the numbers had already told them what she was now telling them. They had simply hoped she wouldn't figure it out. She answered on the second ring. "Miss Carter," Gerald said, "Mr. Whitmore would like to schedule a formal negotiation session. Given the timeline considerations, he is proposing the day after tomorrow, Thursday. He would like to return to the same location if you are amenable." She had not expected that. She had expected him to insist on a conference room on his turf on some version of terrain that felt controllable. "Lou's," she said. "Yes." She understood immediately. He wanted the same room because he had spent 2.5 hours processing what had happened there and had decided he could do better. He believed he had underperformed in that first meeting, that he had let her catch him off guard, and he wanted the same setting so he could correct for it. He was thinking about the rematch. That she thought was the most useful piece of information he had given her all week. He was still thinking in terms of winning and losing a conversation. He had not yet accepted that the conversation was already over. "Thursday," she said, 9 o'clock. "He will be bringing a full legal team," Gerald said, "and a financial representative." "I'll be bringing Arthur Pendleton," she said. A pause. "Ms. Carter, our position remains that the Apex Solutions ownership structure represents an administrative—" "Gerald," she said, "I'll see you Thursday." She ended the call. She sat in the motel room and she breathed for a moment, and then she picked up the phone again and called Pendleton and told him the meeting was Thursday and asked if he would come. "Of course," he said, and then Okafor. "I've retained him," she said. "He's reviewing the S1 filing tonight." A pause. "Ms. Carter, I want to make sure you understand what you're walking into. Ethan Whitmore is going to come to that table with everything he has. He will have spent 48 hours building the most aggressive legal position available to him. He is going to try to pressure you, to confuse you, to make you doubt the strength of what you hold. He is very good at this." "I know," she said. "I watched him do it for 19 years. That's different from being the target of it." "Arthur," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. "I need you to trust that I know this man. I need you to trust that the preparation I am doing is not naive. And I need you to be in that room Thursday as my attorney, not as my guardian." A long pause. 9 o'clock, he said. 9 o'clock. She spent Wednesday the way she had spent the previous 4 days, reading, researching, preparing. But Wednesday had a different quality. The desperate energy of survival had shifted into something more deliberate. She was no longer looking for the door. She had found it. Now she was thinking about what happened after she walked through it. She called James Okafor at 8 in the morning. "The S1, he said without preamble, as though he had been waiting for her call. "I've read it 3 times. The IP representations are explicit. There is a section page 47 of the prospectus that states, and I quote directly, that Whitmore Capital holds clear and unencumbered title to all foundational intellectual property underlying its product lines. That representation is signed by Ethan Whitmore personally as CEO and countersigned by the CFO and the General Counsel." "And it's false," she said. "It is materially inaccurate," he said. "Whether it rises to intentional fraud depends on the timeline of his knowledge. If we can establish when he became aware of the Apex Solutions ownership discrepancy." "His CFO flagged it 4 years ago," she said. "He told me himself." Silence on the line. "He told you that," Okafor said slowly. "In a diner on 44th Street yesterday morning with Gerald Foss sitting 12 feet away at the counter. He said a routine audit flagged it 4 years ago and that correcting it would have required disclosures that were complicated." Another silence. "Ms. Carter," Okafor said, and his voice had changed, sharpened, tightened the way a person's voice changes when they understand that the case they thought they were handling has become something considerably larger. "I need you to write down exactly what he said, every word you can remember, and I need you to do it right now before the memory compresses." She had already done it. She had written it down in the notebook the same evening, sitting in the motel room, while the conversation was still precise in her mind. She read it to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You understand," he said carefully, "that what you just described is an admission, not necessarily a criminal confession, not without corroboration, but an admission of knowledge. If he made that statement voluntarily, in a semi-public setting in front of witnesses—" "Gerald was at the counter," she said, "and there was a junior attorney, Thomas. I don't know his last name." "I'll find it," Okafor said. "Ms. Carter, tomorrow's negotiation has just changed scope significantly. Are you prepared for that?" She looked at the notebook on the desk, at the 3 pages of clean numbered facts, at her mother's photograph against the wall. "Tell me what I need to know," she said. He told her for the next 2 hours. By the time she hung up, the light had changed outside the window, and she had 4 more pages of notes and a very clear picture of the 2 parallel tracks that now existed: the civil ownership claim over Apex Solutions and the potential federal exposure arising from the S1 misrepresentation. The first track gave her leverage. The second track gave her something she had not fully anticipated when she walked into Lou's the first time. It gave her the ability to end him completely. And that was a power she had not wanted, and was not sure she wanted now, and had to think about very carefully. She thought about it through the afternoon and into the evening, eating a bowl of soup from the bodega, and sitting at the desk and turning the question over. She was not a person who believed in destruction as an end in itself. She had never been. Even now, with everything he had done laid out in front of her, in precise legal language, the satisfaction she was after was not his ruin. It was the correction of a wrong, the restoration of something that should never have been taken. But she also understood, with the cold clarity she had developed over the past 9 days, that his willingness to make that correction depended entirely on his belief that she was capable of using the full weight of what she held. She could not walk into that room tomorrow with Mercy already in her pocket. Mercy was for after the papers were signed. Thursday arrived gray and cold, the same as every morning that week. She was at Lou's at 8:40. She ordered coffee and she sat in the same booth as before, and she did not look at her phone. She looked at the people around her, the construction workers at the counter, the woman in nursing scrubs eating eggs and reading something on her tablet, the old man in the corner who came every day, she suspected because the booth was warm and the coffee was cheap and nobody asked him to leave. She thought, I have been in a version of this room my whole life. I just didn't know it. Pendleton arrived at 8:52. He sat down across from her, ordered nothing, set his briefcase on the seat beside him, and said, "Okafor called me." "I know," she said. "He said the scope has changed." "Yes." Pendleton studied her. "How are you holding this?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, not professional courtesy. She thought about it honestly. "1 hour at a time," she said. "The same way my mother held everything." He nodded. Ethan arrived at 9:01, 1 minute late instead of 6, closer to punctual, which told her the performance of superiority had been dialed back in favor of something more tactical. He came in with Gerald and Thomas, and a woman she didn't know, mid-40s, in a gray suit that had the quiet authority of serious money, a financial advisor or a senior investment banker, Madeline assessed. Someone brought to translate the numbers. He also brought someone she had not expected. The man who came in last was tall, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of a person accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. Madeline recognized him from a photograph she had seen in a business journal years ago. His name was Heiress & Polk, and he was the lead underwriter on the Whitmore Capital IPO. She understood in an instant what this meant. Ethan had not told Polk about the ownership problem. He had told Polk he was meeting with a disgruntled former wife, a nuisance to be managed. He had brought Polk here to observe, to provide the implicit weight of institutional authority, to make her feel the room closing in. She looked at Heiress & Polk. She thought he doesn't know yet, and she thought this is either Ethan's most aggressive move or his most desperate mistake. And in her experience with this particular man, those two things were often identical. They arranged themselves across from her, Ethan in the center, Gerald to his right, Polk to his left, the woman in gray at the end, Thomas behind with the briefcase. Pendleton sat beside Madeline and said nothing. Ethan looked at her and said, "I'd like to begin by introducing Heiress & Polk, who represents the underwriting consortium for—" "I know who he is," Madeline said. Polk looked at her. His expression was neutral professional, the expression of a man who had been in 1,000 rooms like this and had learned to reveal nothing until he understood the terrain. "Ms. Carter," Polk said, "Ethan has explained that there are some administrative complexities regarding the company's IP structure that you've become aware of. We're hoping to resolve those today in a way that allows the offering to proceed on schedule." She looked at him steadily. "What exactly did Ethan tell you those complexities are?" she asked. Polk glanced at Ethan. "A paperwork issue, an ownership registration that was intended to be transferred and wasn't." She nodded slowly. "A paperwork issue," she repeated. "Ms. Carter," Gerald said quickly, "perhaps we could—" "Mr. Polk," she said, speaking directly to the underwriter. "I want to make sure you have complete information before this conversation goes any further, because the information you have right now, the paperwork issue framing, is not complete. And you are a man with significant legal and professional obligations arising from the S-1 filing your firm is sponsoring." Polk's expression shifted, fractionally, but she caught it. "The ownership of Apex Solutions, LLC," she said, "which holds the foundational patent underlying every product line, every licensing agreement, and every subsidiary of Whitmore Capital, is registered solely in my name. It has been registered in my name for 19 years. It has never been transferred. And the S-1 filing that your firm co-signed represents that Whitmore Capital holds clear and unencumbered title to that IP." The silence in the booth was complete. Polk turned to look at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. "Ethan," Polk said, and the one word carried the weight of everything. The weight of the offering, the institutional relationships, the legal exposure, the careers of the people on his team who had signed their names to a document containing a material misrepresentation. "Is this accurate?" "It is a matter under," Gerald began. "I am asking Ethan," Polk said. Another silence, longer this time. "The structure was always intended to be temporary," Ethan said. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it had begun to give. The transfer was supposed to be handled years ago. It was an oversight. An oversight, Polk said. Ethan, I co-signed a prospectus that represents clean IP title. My firm co-signed that document. If what this woman is describing is accurate, we have a significant problem that goes considerably beyond a paperwork issue. Harrison. Do not, Polk said very quietly, say my first name to me right now. The table went absolutely still. Madeline watched Ethan receive that, watched the man who had never in his professional life been spoken to that way by someone he considered a peer, absorb it without the ability to do anything about it. She watched his jaw tighten and his hands press flat on the table, the same gesture as before, and she thought, there it is. That's the tell. Every time the ground moves, his hands go flat. She gave it 10 seconds. Then she said, Mr. Polk, I want to be transparent with you about something because you are in this room under a misapprehension, and that is not a position I put you in deliberately. You were brought here without full information. What I am about to tell you is relevant to decisions you will need to make independently of whatever happens at this table today. Polk looked at her. She told him about the S1 representation. She told him about the 4-year timeline. She told him in clean and precise language that James Okafor had helped her organize over 2 hours of calls, exactly what the regulatory exposure looked like when a material misrepresentation was knowingly permitted to stand in a federal securities filing. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anger. She stated facts in the order they occurred, and she let the facts do the work. When she finished, Polk sat back in his chair. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he looked at Gerald. Then he said to no one in particular, I need to make a phone call. He stood straightening his jacket with the automatic precision of a man who manages his exterior when his interior is in crisis. Excuse me. He walked out of the booth and toward the door and pushed through onto the sidewalk. Gerald immediately leaned toward Ethan and began speaking in a rapid, low voice that Madeline caught fragments of legal exposure settlement framework, damage containment. Ethan was not looking at Gerald. He was looking at Madeline. She looked back. You brought him here to intimidate me, she said quietly under Gerald's rapid murmur. You thought if I saw the lead underwriter sitting across from me, I would understand the scale of what I was challenging, and I would shrink. I thought, Ethan said, equally quiet, that having all parties in the room would accelerate resolution. It did, she said, just not in the direction you planned. Gerald stopped talking. Outside on the sidewalk, through the glass, they could see Polk on his phone. His posture told everything the squared shoulders of a man delivering news he does not want to deliver to people who are not going to want to hear it. The woman in gray, who had not spoken a single word, quietly closed the folder in front of her and set down her pen. Ms. Carter, Gerald said, and his voice had changed. The professional smoothness was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, a recalibration toward a position he had perhaps prepared for, but hoped he wouldn't need. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to discuss a comprehensive resolution. We would like to understand specifically what terms you consider acceptable before we respond to your ownership claim. Before I give you terms, she said, I want something from Ethan directly. Gerald looked at Ethan. Ethan said, What? I want you to say in this room that the prenuptial agreement was not signed by me. Gerald said immediately, I cannot advise Gerald. Ethan's voice was flat. He looked at Madeline. A muscle in his jaw moved. The prenuptial agreement was not signed by you. She absorbed that. She had not been certain until this moment that he would say it. She had held the probability at 60% high, but not certain. The fact that he had said it here with Gerald present and Thomas taking notes told her that his attorneys had already determined that fighting the prenuptial fraud claim on top of the IP ownership dispute and the S1 exposure was a war on too many fronts simultaneously. He was beginning to choose what to sacrifice. Thank you, she said. She reached into her bag and she set the folder on the table. Not the folder from Pendleton, a new one assembled over the past 2 days, organized into clean sections that James Okafor had reviewed and approved. My terms are as follows, she said. I will transfer Apex Solutions LLC to a new jointly held entity with conditions. In exchange for that transfer, which resolves the IP ownership issue and allows the IPO to proceed, I receive 51% controlling ownership of Whitmore Capital's restructured board. Not a seat, not an advisory role. Controlling ownership, 51%. Gerald made a sound. Ethan said nothing. Additionally, she said the original divorce settlement is voided in full. The prenuptial agreement is acknowledged as fraudulent and withdrawn from the record. The marital estate, including the Riverside apartment, the Connecticut property, the investment accounts, and the commingled funds that included my mother's inheritance, is subject to equitable division under New York law, with an independent auditor appointed to establish fair value. Madeline, Ethan said. His voice had lost the controlled quality. Something raw had moved into it. 51% is the company. You're asking me to hand you the company. I am asking you, she said, to give me what the law already says is mine, and to give me a position that reflects 19 years of contribution that you never acknowledged and never compensated. 51% is not a punishment. It is a correction. And if I refuse, he said. She looked at him. If you refuse, she said, I file the Apex Solutions ownership claim today. The underwriters learn about it by this evening if they haven't already given that Harrison Polk is currently on the sidewalk making phone calls. The IPO collapses. The debt obligations come due. Okafor files the civil ownership claim on Monday and refers the S1 representation issue to the SEC's Enforcement Division for review. And you spend the next several years fighting on 3 simultaneous fronts: civil, regulatory, and whatever the investors do when they understand what happened with no operating capital because the company is insolvent. Pamati tiumi sabasat. She paused. Or, she said, you sign today, the IPO proceeds on schedule, the company survives, and 5 years from now you can tell whatever story you want about how the restructuring happened. Ethan looked at the table. She waited. Outside, Polk came back through the door. He walked to the table and looked at Ethan and said very quietly, My firm is suspending participation in the offering pending legal review of the IP ownership structure. That suspension becomes public if we don't have a resolution and a clean legal opinion by Monday morning. He picked up his coat from the seat. I'm sorry, Ethan. This is not a position I can hold. He left. The woman in gray stood and left without speaking. Thomas closed his notepad. Gerald sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at Ethan with the expression of an attorney who has given the best advice available and whose client did not take it. The booth was very quiet. Ethan sat across from Madeline in Lou's diner on a Thursday morning with the coffee cooling between them and the sounds of the city carrying on outside, entirely indifferent to the fact that in this particular booth, a man's empire had just been handed back to the woman he had discarded, and the only question remaining was whether he had the intelligence to understand it. She did not push. She had learned watching him for 19 years that pushing Ethan Whitmore at the moment of maximum pressure produced defiance. He had to arrive at the conclusion himself, even when the conclusion was foregone. He had to believe on some level that he had chosen it. She picked up her coffee. It was cold, but she drank it anyway. She thought about her mother in the winter coat. About $38,000 a year and $112,000 saved. About the patience that had looked to the outside world like smallness and had actually been the deepest form of strength she had ever witnessed. She thought about Gloria Reyes making 4 phone calls without hesitation, about Patricia Webb calling from her personal cell, about James Okafor's voice sharpening on the phone when he understood the scope of what she had, about Arthur Pendleton sitting quietly beside her in this booth, not speaking, not performing, simply present. She thought about the woman who had stood in the rain outside a Manhattan law office 8 days ago with $32 and a cracked phone and a suitcase that bumped over the wet sidewalk. She thought, look how far she's come in 8 days. Ethan said, I want a non-disclosure provision. She looked at him. For the personal details, he said. The ring, the prenuptial, the calls I made to contacts, I want those covered under a mutual NDA. She considered this. Mutual, she said. Mutual. She looked at Pendleton. Pendleton gave the smallest nod. Mutual meant she was also covered he could not speak publicly about her or the ownership discovery or anything that happened in these 2 meetings. Gerald will draft it today, Ethan said. You'll have terms by 6 this evening. I'll have Okafor review them by 9 tomorrow morning, she said. The signing, he said, and he stopped. Saturday, she said, Pendleton's office, 10 o'clock. He nodded. He sat there for another moment without moving, and she had the sense that he was doing something he did not know how to do, had perhaps never learned to do, sitting with a loss. Not managing it, not spinning it, not already building the next move, just sitting with the fact that something was over. You knew, he said finally, not accusatory, almost quiet. When you walked out of my conference room, you didn't know about Apex Solutions, but you knew something wasn't finished. She thought about the elevator, the counting numbers, the decision she had made between 42 and the lobby. I knew, she said, that you are not the kind of man who leaves things unfinished without a reason. And I knew that a man as careful as you doesn't strip someone as completely as you tried to strip me without being afraid of what they might find if they had the resources to look. She paused. You were afraid of me, Ethan. You just disguised it as contempt. He said nothing. She picked up her bag. She stood. Saturday, she said, 10 o'clock. She walked out of Lou's diner for the second time in 3 days, and the cold air hit her, and this time it did not feel like punishment. It felt like weather. Just weather. The ordinary cold of an ordinary Thursday morning in a city that had been here long before Ethan Whitmore built his empire and would be here long after it was rebuilt under different hands. She pulled out her phone. She called Okafor. He said yes, she said. A pause. All terms, she said. Gerald is drafting tonight. I need you at Pendleton's office Saturday at 10. I'll be there, Okafor said. And then, Ms. Carter, how do you feel? She stood on the sidewalk, and she thought about it honestly. I feel, she said, like my mother would have approved. And for the first time in 9 days, she meant something by those words that was not grief. Something that sat alongside the grief and did not diminish it, and was not diminished by it. Something that felt cautiously and completely like the beginning of what came next. The documents arrived at Pendleton's office at 5:58 on Friday evening, which was 2 minutes before the close of business, and a deliberate calculation, Gerald giving himself maximum hours before the Saturday signing, while technically meeting the Thursday evening deadline that Madeline had set. She recognized the move. It was exactly the kind of small, petty reclamation of control that men like Gerald performed when the larger control was already gone. She did not comment on it. She called Okafor at 6:03. I have them, she said. Read me the ownership transfer clause, he said. She read it. He was quiet for a moment. The language on the board voting structure is narrow. See the clause beginning with notwithstanding on page 4. He's trying to define controlling interest in a way that limits your operational authority over executive appointments. She found it. She read it twice. He wants 51% of the votes, but not 51% of the decisions, she said. Precisely, Okafor said. Gerald is very good. I'll give him that. Can we push back tonight? I'll send a red line by 9, he said. Gerald will hate it, but Gerald will accept it because the alternative is what we discussed yesterday, and the clock has not changed. She sat with the documents spread across the desk in the motel room, the same desk where she had read legal research at 5 in the morning 10 days ago, with nothing in her pocket but $32 and a determination she couldn't yet name. And she waited for Okafor's red line, and she thought about Saturday. She thought about walking into Pendleton's office with everything she currently held and walking out with everything she was owed. She thought about what happened after. She had been so focused on the negotiation, on the legal architecture, on the precise and careful dismantling of the structure Ethan had built to contain her, that she had not fully allowed herself to think about what she was going to do with 51% of a $3.4 billion company. She was a woman who had spent 19 years managing the invisible infrastructure of a powerful man's world. She understood relationship capital and organizational dynamics and the way trust moved through a system. She understood better than most people who had spent those 19 years in formal business roles that companies were not balance sheets. They were people and patterns and the decisions that accumulated into culture. She had watched Ethan's company for 19 years. She knew exactly what was wrong with it. Okafor's red line arrived at 8:47. She read it and then called him. "The executive appointment clause," she said. "You've given me unilateral authority over the C-suite within the first 90 days. Yes. Gerald won't accept that. Gerald will negotiate it to a joint approval process with a tiebreaker mechanism," Okafor said, "which is what I actually want. The unilateral language is the opening. The tiebreaker is the landing point. In a 51-49 structure, the tiebreaker always goes to the majority holder." She understood. "You started high, so he thinks he won something." "Gerald needs to feel that he has protected his client," Okafor said. "If Gerald feels he has protected his client, he signs. If he feels he has lost completely, he advises Ethan to walk away and take the consequences, because attorneys always prefer the war they know to the peace they don't." She sat with this. "James," she said. "Yes. Thank you for all of it." A pause. "Ms. Carter, in 31 years of IP litigation, I have never seen anyone walk into a negotiation with less formal support and more fundamental clarity. You knew what you had. You knew what it was worth. And you did not let anyone in that room tell you otherwise." He paused. "That is rarer than you would think." She put the phone down. She looked at her mother's photograph. She said quietly to the photograph, "Saturday." Gerald called at 11:23 that night, past 11 on a Friday, which was its own testament to how much pressure was now inside the Whitmore operation. He accepted the tiebreaker mechanism and 3 other minor modifications. He tried to reinsert a clause limiting her public communications about the ownership history. She told him that clause was non-negotiable and it was going out. He accepted that too. She confirmed Saturday at 10. She did not sleep much, but the wakefulness was different now. Not anxious, not desperate, not the circling exhaustion of a person trying to outrun catastrophe. It was the wakefulness of a person standing at the edge of something enormous and very still, the way her mother had stood at her father's funeral, composed, present, and entirely clear about who she was. Saturday morning she woke at 5. She showered. She put on the charcoal silk blouse, the grandmother's silver earrings. She looked at herself in the mirror with the same steady attention she had paid herself on the morning of the first diner meeting, and what she saw was not the same woman who had stood in this mirror 10 days ago. Not dramatically different on the outside, but behind the eyes something had consolidated. Something that had always been there but had been compressed and buried under 19 years of making someone else's world run smoothly had found its shape again. She picked up her mother's photograph. She put it in her bag. She arrived at Pendleton's office at 9:30. Pendleton was already there. Okafor arrived 12 minutes later with a young associate who carried the execution copies of every document in a neat accordion file. They sat at the conference table, and Okafor walked her through each signature page one final time, explaining what she was signing and what it meant in language that was precise without being condescending. She listened to every word. At 9:58, Gerald Foss arrived. At 10:04, Ethan Whitmore walked through the door. He looked like he had not slept in several days, which was probably true. He was still impeccably dressed. The armor was still there, but it sat differently on him now, like something maintained by habit rather than by genuine confidence. He came in, and he looked at the table, and he looked at her, and he sat down without speaking. Gerald began the formal process, immediately moving through documents with the brisk efficiency of a man who wants to get something over with. Each transfer document was explained, initialed, signed. The Apex Solutions transfer, the board restructuring, the executive appointment framework, the acknowledgement of the prenuptial fraud, the voiding of the original settlement, the equitable division of the marital estate with a named auditor agreed upon by both parties, page after page, signature after signature. She signed each one clearly and completely the same way she had signed those divorce papers 2 weeks ago in a different conference room, except that this time what she was signing was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Halfway through the stack, she paused. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at the table. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. He looked. "The CFO," she said, "and the general counsel, the ones who co-signed the S1 with the IP representation. Were they aware of the Apex Solution structure when they signed?" A beat of silence. Gerald's pen stopped. "That is not," Gerald began. "Gerald," Ethan said. He looked at Madeline. Something moved through his face, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the armor just briefly. "Marcus knew," he said. Chen did not. Marcus was the CFO. She filed that. She did not say anything else about it at the table, but she filed it. They finished at 11:47. The final page was a summary document, a single sheet that consolidated the key terms of the agreement in plain language required by the New York courts for certain classes of settlement. It was signed by both parties and witnessed by both attorneys and notarized by a woman who had come up from the building's ground floor office for exactly this purpose. When it was done, Gerald stacked his copies, clicked his pen, and stood. Ethan sat for a moment longer. He picked up the cubic zirconia ring from the table between them. She had set it there before the meeting began without explanation, and no one had commented on it. He turned it in his fingers, set it back down. He stood. He looked at her one final time. She thought he was going to say something. She could see him composing. It could see the familiar architecture of Ethan Whitmore constructing a sentence that would allow him to exit with some version of grace or authority intact. She had watched him do this 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. He didn't say it. Whatever it was, he let it go. He walked out. Gerald followed without looking at anyone. The room was quiet. Okafor's associate began carefully organizing the signed execution copies into separate folders. Pendleton sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Okafor looked at Madeline. "Well," he said. She picked up the cubic zirconia ring from the table. She held it up one last time in the light. Then she set it down on the conference table and she left it there. She did not need to carry it anymore. The first week after the signing was administrative, in the way that enormous changes always are the paperwork that follows. The paperwork, the notifications to regulatory bodies, the communications to the board that had to be carefully handled, so that the restructuring was understood as a resolution rather than a hostile event. Okafor's team managed most of it. She was on the phone for 8 to 12 hours a day, learning at an accelerating pace the operational details of a company she had lived beside for 19 years without ever being allowed inside. What she found when she got inside was roughly what she had expected, and in one significant way, considerably worse. The company's culture was built entirely around Ethan's personality, his decision-making style, his preference for secrecy and concentrated authority, his habit of rewarding loyalty above competence. There were genuinely talented people buried 3 and 4 levels down in the organization who had been systematically passed over because they had the wrong kind of talent, the kind that asked questions, the kind that built systems rather than empires, the kind that made themselves useful rather than indispensable to one powerful person. She met with the department heads in the first week one by one, not in a conference room but in their own spaces. She asked each of them the same question: what would you fix first if you could fix anything? The answers were revelatory. The head of product development, a woman named Serena Park, who had been with the company for 11 years and had been passed over for promotion twice, said without hesitation, "The patent licensing structure. We're leaving 40% of our revenue potential on the table because the licensing terms were designed to maximize Ethan's personal control rather than the company's market share." The head of engineering, a quiet man named David Lim, said, "The documentation. Nobody knows how anything actually works because Ethan never wanted institutional knowledge. He wanted key person dependency. If he left, the company couldn't function. That's not a company. That's a hostage situation." The head of legal, not the general counsel Chen, who had resigned 3 days after the signing, but the deputy general counsel, a careful woman named Rita Albanese, who had been waiting in that role for 6 years, said, "The compliance framework. It's not there. There are policies on paper and nothing in practice. We've been operating on Ethan's reputation as a substitute for actual governance." Madeline wrote everything down. She went back to the motel each evening. She was still in the motel, had not yet moved because there had been no time and no bandwidth, and because in a way she did not fully examine, she was not ready to leave until she had made decisions about what came next. And she read and she thought, and she built the restructuring plan the way she had once built her graduate thesis, from first principles, from what the thing actually needed, rather than what it had always had. At the end of the second week, she called an all-company meeting. 340 people gathered in the main conference center of Whitmore Capital's offices, which she had not yet moved into. She was still operating from a borrowed desk in Pendleton's office, and she stood at the front of the room and she looked at them. She said, "My name is Madeline Carter. Some of you know the outline of what happened here. Most of you know a version of it that involves a great deal of uncertainty. I want to address that uncertainty directly because I think you deserve directness and because the culture of this company has not historically offered it." The room was very still. "This company was built on real intellectual property and real talent," she said. "It was also built on a management philosophy that prioritized control over trust and secrecy over sustainability. Those two things, the real value and the destructive management, have existed side by side for 19 years. What I intend to do is preserve the first and dismantle the second." She looked at the room. "I am not here to punish anyone for surviving in the environment that existed," she said. "I am here to build the environment that should have existed. Some of you will thrive in that environment. Some of you may find it uncomfortable because comfortable people are sometimes the ones most invested in a broken system. I ask you to give the new structure a genuine chance before you make a decision about whether you belong here." She paused. "And I ask you to tell me the truth about what's broken, about what's working, about what you see that I don't yet see. I will not punish honesty. I will not reward the kind of loyalty that requires silence. Those days are over." The room remained still for a moment, and then Serena Park from the third row started to applaud. It moved through the room slowly, and then all at once, the way that things do when people have been waiting for permission to feel something. Madeline stood at the front of the room, and she did not perform emotion, and she did not perform strength. She simply received it. The first major decision she made was the Marcus situation. The CFO who had co-signed the S1, knowing about the Apex Solutions ownership discrepancy, was a man named Marcus Webb, no relation to Patricia, who had been with Ethan for 14 years, and who in the 2 weeks since the signing had been waiting in his office like a man waiting for a verdict. She met with him on a Wednesday morning alone, no attorneys. He came in and sat down, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided in advance to accept whatever is coming. "You knew about Apex Solutions when you signed the S1, she said. "Yes," he said. "Did you raise it with Ethan?" A pause. "I raised it in 2022 when the audit flagged it. He told me it was being handled. He told me again in 2023. When the S1 process began, I asked again, and he said the legal team had a structure to address it at closing." He looked at the table. "I believed him, or I chose to believe him. I'm not sure those are different things." She studied him. "They're different things," she said. "Choosing to believe something you have reason to doubt is not the same as being deceived." He looked up. "But," she said, "it is also not the same as complicity with intent, and I am not in the business of destroying people who made bad choices under pressure from a man who is very good at applying pressure." She paused. "I am in the business of building a company that doesn't create those situations." "What does that mean for me?" he asked. "It means you are going to work with Rita Albanese on a complete rebuild of the compliance framework," she said. "It means your role changes. The title stays. The authority over compliance decisions transfers to Rita with your support and institutional knowledge behind her. It means you are on a 1-year performance framework, and at the end of that year, I will reassess." She paused. "It also means that if you are ever again in a position where you know something material is wrong and the person above you tells you it's being handled, you come to me directly, not to my assistant, to me." He sat with this. "Why are you giving me that?" he said. "I wouldn't have." "I know," she said. "That's partly why I'm giving it to you, because I want you to understand the difference." He nodded. He left. She picked up the phone and called Okafor. "The SEC referral," she said. "Is there a window where voluntary disclosure and cooperation affects the outcome?" "Always," he said immediately. "Are you thinking about Marcus?" "I'm thinking about the company," she said. "I don't want to build the new structure on top of an unresolved federal exposure. I want to get ahead of it. Voluntary disclosure, full cooperation, remediation plan in place. It's better for the company, it's better for the people who didn't know, and it gives the people who did a chance to demonstrate they understand what they did wrong." A pause. That is a very sophisticated reading of the regulatory environment, Okafor said. I've been reading for 2 weeks, she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, genuine, unguarded. I'll make the calls, he said. The IPO, which had been suspended pending resolution of the ownership dispute, was relaunched with amended filings 3 weeks after the signing. The amended prospectus included a full disclosure of the Apex Solutions ownership history, the resolution of the dispute, and the restructured board and management framework. It also included in the section on corporate governance language that Madeline had written herself and that Rita Albanese had refined a formal commitment to transparency, independent audit, and a whistleblower protection framework with direct reporting access to the board. The institutional investors who had pulled back when Polk's firm suspended their participation did not immediately return. For 4 days, the amended offering sat in the market with uncertain support, and she got calls from 3 board members in those 4 days asking whether she had considered pulling back, scaling down, waiting for a quieter moment. She told each of them the same thing. The company's value is real. The IP is real. The talent is real. If investors won't support a company that disclosed its problems voluntarily and remediated them transparently, then those are not the investors this company needs at this stage of its growth. We wait for the right ones. On the 5th day, a sovereign wealth fund out of Singapore submitted an anchor order. By the 6th day, 3 institutional investors had returned. By the 7th day, the book was oversubscribed. The IPO priced on a Thursday morning in April, 3 months after the divorce papers had been slid across a mahogany table in a 42nd floor conference room, and it priced 11% above the original target valuation. Not $3.4 billion, $3.78. The morning of the pricing, Madeline was in the offices early. She was on her 4th cup of coffee, and her phone had been ringing since 6 in the morning, and she had taken every call personally because she had decided in the 2nd week of the restructuring that the CEO of this company answered her own phone when it mattered. Serena Park knocked on the open office door at 7:45 and said the final pricing just came through. Madeline looked at the number Serena handed her. She sat with it for a moment. She thought about $32. She thought about a bodega roll and a $2 notebook and a second-hand laptop and a cubic zirconia ring in a jeweler's loop. She thought about her mother in the winter coat. She set the paper down on the desk. "Thank you, Serena," she said. Serena started to leave and then turned back. "Miss Carter, how does it feel?" Madeline thought about it honestly, the way she had been trying to think about everything since the motel room, without performance, without the answer that sounded right, with just the actual truth of it. "It feels," she said, "like the beginning of the work." Serena smiled. "Good answer," she said, and left. 2 weeks after the IPO on a Tuesday evening, Madeline received a call from a number she recognized as belonging to Monica Ethan's now former fiancé. She stared at the name on the screen for a moment and then answered. Monica's voice was quiet and careful. "I hope you don't mind me calling. How did you get this number?" "Patricia Webb. She thought you might be willing to talk." Madeline sat back. "What can I do for you, Monica?" A pause. "I left Ethan 3 weeks ago, the week after the IPO priced." A breath. "I know you probably don't have any reason to care about that. But I wanted you to know. I don't know what I wanted, to say that I wasn't what he told me you were. I knew something was wrong. I made choices that—" She stopped. "I'm sorry." Madeline held the phone, and she thought about the credit card statements she had found 6 months before the divorce, and the 3 weeks of quiet confirmation, and the conference room, and the Rolex. She thought about what her mother would have done with a phone call like this. "Monica," she said, "are you safe?" A surprised pause. "Yes. I have an apartment. I have a job. I'm fine, I think." "Good," Madeline said. "That's what matters. Take care of yourself." She ended the call. She sat with it for a moment. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindicated. She felt something quieter than either the specific piece of a person who has stopped needing someone else's loss to confirm her own value. That was worth noting. She noted it. The news about Ethan came in fragments over the following months, the way news about people always does when they are no longer the center of your world. She did not seek it out. It arrived through Patricia and through the general background noise of the industry she now operated in. He had moved out of the Riverside apartment when the equitable division settlement transferred it to the marital estate pool. He was living in a 2-bedroom rental in a building he would once have walked past without registering. He had launched a consulting practice, the inevitable move of a man whose identity is built on expertise and who cannot conceive of himself as something other than essential. The practice had attracted 2 clients in 6 months. She heard this, and she felt nothing sharp about it, just the mild human sadness of a person witnessing what happens when someone builds an empire on control rather than on something real and watches it reveal itself as having always been made of air. In June, 5 months after the signing, 4 months after the IPO, the New York Stock Exchange held a small ceremony marking Whitmore Capital's first quarter as a public company. It was not the kind of event that generated significant press. A photograph, a small gathering, a commemorative moment that mattered more internally than externally. She stood on the floor of the exchange with Serena Park to her left and Rita Albanese to her right, and Okafor in the back of the group, and Pendleton beside him, and around them a company of 340 people who had spent the past several months discovering that they were capable of more than they had been allowed to demonstrate. A photographer from the financial press asked her to look at the camera. She thought about the elevator. She thought about the rain. She looked at the camera. She looked like a woman who had always been going to end up exactly here. Not because it had been inevitable, not because the universe had conspired toward justice, not because good things happen to people who deserve them. She had lived long enough to know that they often don't. But because she had stood in a motel room with $32 and refused quietly and completely and without drama to accept that the story was over. She had known something that Ethan Whitmore had failed in all his careful planning and all his accumulated power, to understand that the most dangerous person in any room is not the one with the most resources. It is the one who has been underestimated so completely that nobody thought to account for them. He had looked at her silence for 19 years and seen compliance. He had not seen what silence actually is when it belongs to a woman like her mother, like her, a form of patience so deep it is indistinguishable from stillness, and so complete that when it finally moves, there is nothing left to stop it. The photograph was taken. The ceremony ended. She walked out of the New York Stock Exchange into the June morning with her phone already ringing and 3 decisions already forming and the work already waiting. The way good work always does, without drama, without fanfare, simply present and real and entirely hers. He had not lost her because she was weak. He had lost everything because he mistook her silence for the absence of power when it had been from the very beginning the fullest expression of it.